The laughter didn't start quietly. It exploded loud, mocking, cruel. Steven Seagal had barely stepped inside the biker bar when the eyes locked onto him. Not his face, not his presence, but his jacket. Old leather, cracked seams, faded brown like it had seen too many winters. One biker nudged another and laughed. Bro, is that thing older than this bar? Another leaned back in his chair, grinning. Looks like he lost a fight with time. The laughter spread like wildfire. Steven didn't react. He calmly walked to the counter and sat down. That made it worse. One biker stood up, pointing openly now. "Hey, old man," he said loudly, "this ain't a costume party." Someone else added, "Wrong jacket. Wrong crowd." Steven slowly placed his hands on the bar. No rush, no anger. Just silence. The bikers circled closer. One of them squinted at his shoulder and scoffed. "What's that ugly patch supposed to be?" Another laughed harder. Probably something he ordered online. They joked. They mocked. They enjoyed it. Because to them, confidence without noise looked like weakness. Steven finally turned his head slightly. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "You shouldn't laugh at things you don't understand." That line only fueled them. "Oh," one biker mocked, "we got a philosopher." Another leaned closer, eyes sharp. "You lost, Grandpa." Steven didn't answer. He stood up slowly. And that's when the jacket shifted under the bar's yellow light. The patch became fully visible. A heavy silence crept in, not all at once, but enough to feel strange. One biker's smile faded. Then another. A bartender froze mid-pour. Because that patch, that wasn't decoration. That wasn't fashion. That was something every real biker recognized. And suddenly, the laughter stopped. The bar didn't calm down after the laughter stopped. It shifted. The kind of shift you feel before something important happens. Engines hummed outside, still warm from the road. Inside, the smell of fuel, leather, and spilled beer hung heavy in the air. This place wasn't just a bar, it was a territory. A space where respect wasn't given easily and ego ruled louder than reason. Steven Seagal stood there quietly. He didn't scan the room, didn't posture, didn't explain himself. He pulled the old leather jacket back into place and returned to the counter as if nothing had happened. That confused them. Because in places like this, silence is usually fear. But Steven's silence wasn't empty. It was controlled. The bikers watched him closely now. The jokes had faded, but the disrespect hadn't. It just changed form, quieter, sharper. One biker leaned toward another and muttered, "Who walks in here alone like that?" Another scoffed, "No colors. No crew. Still sits like he owns the place." The leader of the group finally stepped forward. Tall, broad, confident in a way that came from never being challenged. He rested his hand on the back of the empty chair beside Steven and spoke casually, but loud enough for the room to hear. "You know where you are, right?" Steven nodded slightly. "I do." The biker smiled, not friendly. "Then you know people earn respect here." Steven took a slow sip of water. "I agree." That answer irritated him. Because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't submissive. It was neutral. And neutrality threatens people who rely on dominance. The biker's eyes dropped again to the jacket. "That thing doesn't belong here." Steven finally looked up, calm eyes, no tension. "It belongs to me." A few chuckles returned. To them, clothing was identity, colors meant rank, patches meant permission, and Steven had broken every visible rule, yet behaved like none of them applied. The bartender shifted nervously. He had seen fights start for less. But something about this man felt different, not reckless. Not lost, just aware. The biker leaned closer. "You don't look like someone who understands how things work." Steven replied evenly. "People often confuse noise with understanding." That did it. The biker straightened up. "You're either brave or stupid." Steven paused for a second, then said quietly, "Neither, just experienced." That answer landed heavier than it sounded. Because experience doesn't beg, it doesn't explain, it doesn't rush. The biker laughed it off, but his jaw tightened. Around them, people were watching now. Not cheering, not mocking, observing, because disrespect had been shown clearly and calmly received. And everyone knew. The calm ones are usually the ones you misjudge last. Have you ever been disrespected just because you didn't look like you belonged? Comment yes or no, and if you've lived it, share your story below. Your voice matters. The silence didn't last long. It never does when ego feels challenged. The biker leader chuckled, but it wasn't real laughter. It was the kind people use when they feel their authority slipping and don't know how to pull it back. Experienced, he repeated slowly, in what sitting quietly. A few bikers laughed again, louder this time not because it was funny, but because they needed reassurance. When leaders mock someone, followers join in. It's human nature. People laugh to stay on the winning side. Steven didn't respond. That bothered them more than any insult could have. Because calm doesn't feed ego, it starves it. The biker stepped closer, invading Steven's space, close enough to smell the road dust and leather, close enough to intimidate someone who wasn't prepared. "You come into our place," the biker said, voice rising. "You wear whatever you want, you say whatever you want, and you expect us to just, what? Respect you." Steven met his eyes, not with defiance, not with fear, with understanding. "Respect isn't something you force," Steven said quietly. "It's something you reveal." That sentence confused the room. People understand anger. They understand threats. They understand shouting. But calm statements delivered without emotion, those make people uncomfortable, because they don't know how to respond. The biker scoffed. "You think you're better than us?" Steven shook his head slightly. "No." "Then why act like it?" Steven took a breath, slow, measured. "Because I don't need to prove anything." That hit a nerve. The biker's face hardened. His pride had been bruised, and pride doesn't heal quietly. It demands reaction. He grabbed the edge of Steven's jacket. Not violently. Not yet. Just enough to test him. The bar froze. Everyone knew this moment. This was where men either backed down or things broke. Steven didn't flinch, didn't pull away, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he looked down at the biker's hand, then back up and said calmly, "Let go." 2 words. No threat, no insult, just certainty. The biker laughed loud and exaggerated. Or what? That question wasn't curiosity. It was ego begging for validation. Steven didn't answer immediately. He gently removed the biker's hand from his jacket. Not aggressively, just firmly. That action alone said more than words ever could. A murmur rippled through the room. Because strength doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like control. The biker stepped back, surprised, not hurt, just shaken. "You think you're untouchable," he snapped. Steven replied evenly, "No, I think I'm responsible." That line landed hard. Because irresponsible men seek chaos, responsible men avoid it. The biker didn't like that answer. He turned to the room. "Look at this guy," he said loudly. "Walks in alone. Talks like a monk. Dresses like he's got nothing to lose." Then he pointed at the jacket again, and hides behind an old patch. That was the mistake. Because to Steven, the jacket wasn't fashion. It was memory. It was loss. Discipline, people who didn't make it back. Steven's voice remained calm, but something deeper settled into it. "That patch," he said slowly, "who'sn't for show?" The biker smirked. "Then what is it for?" Steven looked around the room. At the faces watching, at the ones laughing, at the ones already uncomfortable. "It's a reminder," he said, "that not everyone who looks quiet is harmless." The biker stepped forward again. "You threatening us now?" Steven shook his head. "No." Then added, "I'm warning you about yourself." That line sucked the air out of the room. Because deep down, everyone knows when they're crossing a line. The bartender stopped wiping glasses. The music felt too loud. Even the engines outside seemed to fade. The biker leader clenched his jaw. He wanted to win. But he also didn't want to lose face. And that's when ego makes its worst decisions. He reached again, this time toward the patch itself. The room collectively held its breath, because everyone knew. Touching that patch wasn't disrespect. It was a challenge. Have you ever stayed calm while someone tried to provoke you, and won without fighting? Comment calm if you believe control is strength, or ego if you think respect must be forced. The moment the biker's fingers brushed the patch, everything changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but instantly. It was the kind of shift you don't hear, you feel, a sudden tightening in the chest. A quiet instinct whispering that something irreversible had just happened. The biker froze, not because Steven moved, but because the room did. Lauder vanished, not slowly, not awkwardly, gone. The men who had been relaxed seconds ago straightened in their seats. One chair scraped back by instinct. Another biker lowered his drink untouched. Even the leader's crew, the ones who usually laughed the loudest, stopped smiling. Fear doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it spreads through recognition. The bartender's hand trembled slightly as he set the glass down. His eyes were fixed on the patch, now really fixed. Not curious. Not confused. Aware. He had seen that symbol once before. Years ago. On a man who walked into another bar like this one. A man who didn't talk much. A man everyone ignored until they didn't. And nobody forgot how that night ended. The biker leader felt it too. His confidence cracked, just enough for doubt to slip through. Because deep down, people know when they've crossed from dominance into danger. Ego feels powerful at first. But the moment it senses real consequence, it panics. The biker swallowed. His hand slowly pulled away from the patch. Steven hadn't moved. That was the terrifying part. No clenched fists, no squared stance, no raised voice. Just stillness. People misunderstand fear. They think it comes from threats or violence. But real fear comes from certainty, from realizing the other person doesn't need to prove anything. One biker whispered, "That patch." Another finished the thought under his breath. "You don't wear that unless..." Nobody said the rest out loud. They didn't need to. The leader forced a laugh, sharp and brittle. "So what?" he said. "It's just a symbol." But his eyes betrayed him. They kept darting back to the patch. Symbols matter because they carry stories. And stories carry consequences. Every man in that room understood that symbols like that weren't worn for style. They were earned through pain, discipline, and survival. Steven finally spoke. His voice was low, calm, unshaken. "You still have time to step back." That wasn't a threat. It was mercy. The room absorbed it in silence. A younger biker shifted nervously. "We should." The leader shot him a glare. Quiet. But the damage was done. Once fear enters a group, it spreads faster than anger ever could. Because anger pushes people forward. Fear makes them think. The bartender cleared his throat. "Boss," he said carefully, "maybe let it go." That stunned everyone. Bartenders don't choose sides, they choose survival. The biker leader hesitated. His pride screamed at him to double down. But something else, something older and smarter, told him this wasn't a man you cornered. He took a step back. Then another. Not retreat. Recalculation. Steven adjusted his jacket slightly, the patch fully visible now under the bar's warm lights. Not as a warning. As a fact, one by one the bikers moved, not aggressively, respectfully. They created space around Steven without being told. No one wanted to be the next mistake. Phones that had been out earlier were now face down on tables. No one wanted evidence. No one wanted memory. Because everyone could feel it. This wasn't a fight. It was a lesson unfolding in real time. Steven looked around the room. Not triumphantly, not proudly, just observant. "This is how fear works," he said quietly. "It doesn't come from power. It comes from understanding consequences." The leader nodded once, not in defeat, in acknowledgement. The bar exhaled. Because conflict hadn't exploded, it had dissolved. And sometimes that's far more unsettling. Because when fear spreads without violence, everyone remembers why. The silence felt heavier now, not uncomfortable, intentional. The biker leader stared at the patch again, longer this time. Not with arrogance, not with mockery, with calculation. Because in his world symbols were never random, they were language, and this one spoke fluently. He exhaled slowly. "That patch," he said, voice lower than before. "You don't just buy something like that." Steven didn't interrupt. He never did when people were finally thinking. The leader took a step closer, not aggressive, not confrontational. Curious, careful. "I've seen it once," he continued, "years ago, different state, different bar." The room leaned in without realizing it. Because humans are wired for stories, especially when they hint at danger, respect, and survival. "That man," the leader said, "walked in alone too." Steven's eyes stayed calm. The leader swallowed. He didn't talk much either. A murmur passed through the room. The bartender nodded faintly. He remembered now, that same night. That same symbol. That same quiet energy. The leader looked back at Steven. "That patch means you've been places most of us haven't." Steven finally spoke. "It means," he said slowly, "I survived things that didn't need witnesses." That sentence landed deep. Because real experience doesn't brag. It doesn't seek attention. It just exists. The leader gestured toward the patch. "So what are you?" "Military. Some elite unit." Steven shook his head. "No labels." "Then what?" the leader pressed. Steven paused, not for drama, for honesty. "It's a reminder," he said, of discipline, of restraint, of knowing when not to act. That confused some people, because they expected the reveal to be about violence. But this wasn't that kind of power. Humans often assume strength means domination. But real strength is restraint, the ability to walk away even when you could finish things. The leader nodded slowly. That's why you didn't react. Steven met his eyes. That's why I didn't need to. A long breath left the leader's chest. The room felt different now. Lighter, clearer. Because understanding had replaced fear. The leader took another step back and raised his hands slightly. Not surrender, but acknowledgement. We judged you, he said, by your jacket, by your silence. Steven replied calmly, that's how most people judge danger. The bartender spoke up, voice steadier now. That patch, he said, it's not about where you've been, is it? Steven glanced at him. No, he said. It's about who didn't come back. That line silenced the room completely. Because loss is universal, everyone in that bar had lost someone. A brother, a friend, a road partner. And suddenly Steven wasn't an outsider. He was someone who carried weight, quietly. The leader nodded once more. Then you're welcome here. Steven shook his head gently. I was always welcome, he said. I just didn't need permission. That wasn't arrogance, that was certainty. The leader cracked a small smile. Drinks are on us. Steven declined. Just water. That choice said everything. No celebration, no victory lap, no dominance, just presence. As Steven adjusted a jacket again, the patch caught the light one last time. Not as a warning, as a truth. People moved aside naturally now. Respectfully. Because the reveal wasn't about who Steven was. It was about who they had been when they judged him. And that realization stays longer than fear ever does. Do you believe real strength is shown through action or restraint? Common action or restraint? And tell us, have you ever been misjudged because people didn't know your story? Your voice matters. The room didn't return to normal. It reset. That's what happens when power is revealed without force. People don't celebrate, they recalibrate. Because something inside them quietly shifts, their understanding of strength, of control, of what truly commands respect. Steven Seagal stood at the counter, calm as ever, his glass of water untouched for a moment. No one rushed him now. No one tested him. The space around him remained open, intentional. Not out of fear anymore, out of recognition. The biker leader cleared his throat. You could have handled that differently, he said carefully. Steven looked at him, not defensively, not proudly. I've learned, he replied. That violence teaches fast, but understanding lasts longer. That answer explained everything. Human beings respond to power in two ways: fear or respect. Fear fades the moment danger leaves. Respect stays because it's internal. Steven hadn't forced anyone into submission. He'd allowed them to see the consequences of their own assumptions. The leader nodded slowly. Most guys would have swung. Steven shrugged lightly. Most guys need to. That wasn't an insult, it was an observation. A younger biker stepped forward hesitantly. Why come here alone? He asked. No crew, no backup. Steven met his eyes. When you know who you are, he said, you don't need witnesses. That landed hard. Because insecurity always travels in groups. Confidence doesn't. The bartender finally relaxed, returning to his work. Music rose again, softer this time. The bar exhaled collectively, like a storm that had passed without rain. The leader gestured toward an open table. Sit. Talk. Steven shook his head. I'm not here to prove anything. That choice mattered. People often mistake resolution for dominance, the winner standing taller, louder. But real resolution is quiet. It's when no one needs to win because nothing needs to be taken. The leader smiled faintly. Fair enough. Steven finished his water and stood. As he walked toward the door, the room moved instinctively, not to block him, but to clear a path. Respect rearranges space without being asked. A biker held the door open. Steven nodded once in thanks. Outside, the night air was cool. Engines still hummed, but the noise felt distant now. The leader stepped out behind him. You're not what we expected, he said. Steven paused. Neither were you, he replied. But tonight you chose better. That mattered. Because growth doesn't come from being right. It comes from being corrected without being crushed. The leader extended his hand. Steven looked at it for a second. Then shook it. Not as equals in strength. As equals in awareness. The leader spoke quietly. That patch, you wear it with restraint. Steven replied, It reminds me what happens when restraint is lost. They shared a moment of mutual understanding, two men who'd walked different roads but recognized the same truths. Steven turned to leave. As he mounted his bike, a few bikers nodded. No applause, no cheering. Just acknowledgement. Because respect isn't loud, it's precise. As Steven rode off into the night, the bar behind him returned to life, but not the same way. Conversations were different now. Quieter. Thoughtful. People weren't laughing at jackets anymore. They were thinking about judgment. Because the strongest statement Steven made that night wasn't the patch. It was choosing not to use what it represented. The engines faded into the distance. But the lesson stayed. That's how real moments work. Noise disappears. Meaning doesn't. Inside the bar, people returned to their conversations, but not to their old thinking. Something subtle had shifted. They weren't talking louder. They weren't boasting. They were quieter. Thoughtful. Because when assumptions are exposed, the mind doesn't celebrate, it recalibrates. Steven Seagal never raised his voice that night. Never threatened. Never struck. Never proved anything the way people expect power to be proven. And that's exactly why it mattered. Because most people believe respect comes from dominance. From being the loudest. From forcing others to submit. But what they witnessed was different, and far more uncomfortable. They saw a man who didn't react to mockery, didn't match ego with ego, didn't mistake control for weakness. He let people reveal themselves. That's the part most of us miss. When someone insults you, your first instinct is to respond, to defend, to correct, to win. But in doing so, you often give them control over your emotions. Steven never did. He allowed silence to do the work, and silence has a way of making people confront their own behavior. Human beings judge quickly because it feels safe. Clothes, posture, age. Silence, these shortcuts help the brain make fast decisions. But shortcuts also create blind spots. And blind spots are where respect is lost. The bikers didn't misjudge Steven because they were cruel. They misjudged him because they were human. What changed everything wasn't fear of violence. It was recognition. Recognition that strength doesn't always announce itself. That experience doesn't wear labels. That real confidence doesn't ask to be noticed. Steven's jacket didn't demand respect. His restraint did. That patch wasn't a warning. It was a reminder of discipline, of loss, of responsibility. And responsibility is the highest form of power, because anyone can react, anyone can shout, anyone can swing, but not everyone can walk away when they're capable of more. That night wasn't about bikers. It wasn't about jackets. It wasn't even about Steven Seagal. It was about how quickly we decide who someone is and how wrong we often are. The real lesson is simple but uncomfortable. Never judge a person by their clothes, their silence, their calm. Because calm doesn't mean weak. It often means controlled. And control comes from experience. The strongest people you'll ever meet are rarely the loudest in the room. They don't need to prove anything. They already know what they're capable of. And they choose restraint anyway. That choice is power. So the next time you're tempted to laugh at someone who doesn't look like they belong, pause. Because some stories aren't visible. Some strength isn't advertised. And some respect is earned long before you ever notice it. Power doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes. It looks calm. Have you ever been misjudged because people didn't know your story? Type stay calm if you believe real power is self-control, or know your worth if you've learned not to explain yourself anymore. Your voice matters.